what this whole series is meant to do is to think about what are the next steps into adulthood. And might as well start with the question, what is adulthood? You know, what do we mean by adulthood? And it's obviously the case that it's on everybody's mind. It's not always so easy. I mean, they just won't grow up. When will my grown-up kid grow up? What the heck is adulthood? This is an obsession of our whole society right now. And we talk about the millennials and the issues for millennials in growing up. So these are my disclosures, just for you to know. I do get some research funding, and I'm an advisor, et cetera. What I'd like us to talk a little bit about is, first of all, in general, what do we understand are the developmental challenges for transitioning into adulthood that we see in ASD youth? I'm going to spend a little time defining executive functions, because as we learn more about the brain and about executive functions, these become what I call the core abilities that let us move into adulthood, and that if they don't develop properly, then this makes it harder to achieve the tasks that we call, or the challenges of adulthood. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about procrastination as a major obstacle, because it's an area that I'm interested in, and I'll share some strategies for dealing with people who procrastinate. That's one example of a deficit in executive functioning that we've seen. And finally, I'm going to return at the end to what Melita began to talk about, which is what is the family and the parents' role in preparing, okay? So this is how it's going to be divided up. We'll start with the developmental tasks, move into executive functions and executive function deficits, and then opening up the pathways. So, you know, life itself and the kind of unfolding, if you will, of developmental abilities remains to me a miracle. And no matter how much we learn in science, there's something fundamentally mysterious. And what allows a creature to emerge from a cocoon and fly off? You know, how does a little baby develop into this grown-up? And when can and when do our kids become capable of flying? And maybe it isn't flying off. Maybe it's just being able to walk away or go to a different branch and stay nearby. So, you know, we talk about life stages. And somewhere in between childhood and adulthood is this area that we call emerging adulthood. That's a term that Dr. Jeffrey Arnett coined about a little more than a decade ago. And it obviously doesn't suddenly occur. It comes out of an earlier set of stages, which, for example, in adolescence, I'm going to focus on the tasks. What is that the teen needs to do, need to achieve, and then to think about how do these tasks take place in your child or in yourself, if you're someone on the spectrum here listening to me. Well, first of all, how does it affect the way you go through puberty and the changes that occur in your body and the emergence of sexuality? What happens that enables you to take more responsibility for yourself? And we call this sort of the task of self-management or self-regulation. Another task is to figure out who we are. What are we doing here anyway? What are we meant to be here to do? And this isn't an obvious or a given. I mean, and if you think back to your own emerging adulthood, you know, you might have thought one thing one year, and then suddenly you realize, no, that's not who I am. I've got to follow a different path. And so that leads us to talk about the search, what we call the search for a personal set of values. And really, what do I believe in? And this is always occurring in a cultural framework. Because, you know, the United States, as a pluralistic society, we have many, many cultures in this society. So, you know, two kids on the spectrum growing up with different cultural expectations on them will experience this differently. And in many of our traditional cultures, actually, it's expected that you stay home till as long as it takes till you're ready to go off and do your own thing. You know, it's kind of a modern American idea that somehow you go off to college and you leave and you don't come home. And that even is changing, as Melita was alluding to me, the kind of boomerang phenomenon of coming back home and living home for as long as it takes you to feel. Maybe that's actually a more accepting change in our culture. And it kind of makes it easier then for kids who aren't leaving home to not be that different from many of their neurotypical peers. Now, another important task or challenge is the ability to advocate for yourself. And that isn't so easy. And I'm talking about advocating for yourself in the world, not just, with the people you know, but how do you manage to get the world to listen to you and to accept you for who you are? Now, equally important, and this is something that is probably the thing that is most challenging in the kids with the spectrum, is this idea of acquiring social interaction skills. And what are those skills about? And how do those skills get practiced or not? I mean, I was talking with Gail yesterday, most kids, and Melita used this as an example, but like most kids, by the time they're in high school, they're spending most of their time with other kids in high school. Okay, but if you don't have a lot of friends, and if you come home right after school and you're just with your family, then you don't get to practice as much as other people do. So practicing and acquiring and practicing these social interaction skills, how about getting psychologically and emotionally independent? And again, there is no one definition for what that means, but realizing you're separate from your parents and your parents are separate from you, and how do you achieve that independence? It isn't always pretty, and I'll talk about it later, because sometimes emerging teens on the spectrum pick kinds of behaviors and activities that their parents won't approve of. And guess what? In that respect, they're just like any other teens. Okay? They may be doing it more often because they're in your face with it, but they're just asserting their independence. And you've got to think about that. How are you going to accept that and work with it? In line with that is experimenting, and comes in many forms. And last but not least, gaining enough competencies like at problem solving and at mastering some aspect of technology so that you can make it in the world somehow, in some way. Not necessarily totally living on your own or working on your own, but being able to navigate the world means you gain some competencies, okay? So, what is adulthood? Most of us would say there is no uniform definition, but adulthood is the stage in life where an individual accepts responsibility for oneself, makes decisions, becomes independent, and takes on the roles and responsibilities. That's about as good as we can get. Because in each culture, what this means is somewhat different. Okay? So ideally, this is a progression. You become better at making decisions for yourself. You become better at handling money. You become better at thinking for yourself and taking responsibility. What's very interesting is in line with what I said before about this stage of emerging adulthood, as Arnett defined it, it's from 18 to 25, but that was about 10 years ago. And people are now saying, emerging adulthood probably goes till the 30s. And for some people, it may even go to their 40s. And it begins somehow it begins at the end of secondary school, but it ends, who knows? Can't really give it a date because it doesn't follow along a timetable that's set. Turns out that when you look around the world, this period of time called emerging adulthood is actually occurring all around the world, not just in developed countries, but also in developing countries. And people attribute this to a couple of things. Number one, later age of marriage and of having children. Wider access to education, birth control, and some sort of acceptance or a growing acceptance of premarital sexuality and of cohabitation. Right? Again, it's not universally the case, but the fact that there's more tolerance as a result of all these, leads to this period of time where you can leave home but not start your own family. Or you can even come back home and not start your own family, and that's why this period of emerging adulthood is so interesting, and it's, for me, I probably spend most of my time with people on the spectrum and other developmental disabilities, helping them figure this period out, because it isn't clear anymore by what age should you be on your own, okay? Now, there is Dr. Arnett is at Clark University, and they conduct a yearly poll, and they ask both emerging adults and their parents this basic question: what is the key to becoming an adult? And those things I mentioned before, look at the percentages that people report. This is a yearly survey. This is the most recent results of the survey. So when you say the key to becoming an adult is accepting responsibility for yourself, and about 50% of the parents would say yes, and 36% of the emerging adults say achieving adulthood means taking responsibility for yourself. The second one that's even more popular among the emerging adults is becoming financially independent, a little less, about a quarter of the parents, and then finishing your education. Look how low getting married is. Nobody thinks getting married is anything to do with being an adult. So whatever, I know what my grandmother used to say to me. My mom didn't actually believe her, because she kind of said, oh, your grandma's old-fashioned. But she would say, when are you going to get a career and finish your medical school and hang up your shingle and have a family? That was adulthood. And anytime I said, well, I'm not ready for that, you're not being an adult. Well, it turns out nobody thinks that is very important anymore, marriage. All right? That doesn't mean it isn't important. It just means that marriage is no longer seen as the sign that you've achieved adulthood. It really has to do with accepting responsibility, being financially independent, and finishing education. So, to finish up the sort of general discussion before we talk about people on the spectrum and how do they achieve this, there's a lot of important stuff going on, and that's why all these very interesting TV shows that explore this, and movies talk about what? If Sex and the City was about people kind of in their emerging adulthood or towards the latter part of it, and they were, and so was Girls. What was that one about? Girls? It's that HBO show about people in their 20s. And when you listen in and watch the show, what do you find out? You find out that it's all about love, dating, serious involvements, okay? Or maybe not serious involvements, just plain old sex. Then there's work, which means getting ready for your career somehow. Most people in their 20s don't know yet for sure. The weird ones are going to like medical school and psychology, graduate school, and places like that, but the majority are still not figuring it out. What do you do with your leisure time, and do you spend it alone or with others? And what are your new belief systems? Which beliefs are you going to endorse, which ones aren't you? And how are you going to put those beliefs into action? So, the other thing that people describe this as is the age of instability, the age of being self-focused, the age of feeling in between, but the age of possibilities. So notice there's the yin and the yang. There's the good stuff, like exploration, but then there's instability. There's a lot of uncertainty about it, okay? Well, it turns out that for ASD youth, this is a problematic time because it's a different pathway. And so there are delays in getting to these milestones that we think are part and parcel of emerging adulthood. And it's not just these social emotional milestones, but also executive functioning. And that's the part I'm going to focus on, but that isn't the only set of issues. It turns out also that for those that are more aware of their differences from others, there's a greater sense of fragility of one's being different. It's a greater challenge to feeling like I'm a good person, I'm okay. So there's a lot of this self-questioning that goes on. And of course, I'm not saying I see the entire, generalizable sample. I tend to see kids that are having issues, okay? But even when I go online and look at some of the online communities, a lot of the content of the discussion among ASD youth is, how can I be me when the world doesn't seem to all that much get me or like me the way I am? And how do I find a sense of self-acceptance and maybe acceptance by others? Now, the other important issue is that the social environment itself, when you're on the spectrum, may reduce your ability to explore the environment, especially when your program ends, whether at 18 or 21. And now you have to fend for yourself. Where do you go? That community you had in high school vanishes. And I can't tell you the number of kids who I've seen who, when their school ends, when they graduate at 21, are not thrilled about it. They say they are, and they're happy that they don't have to keep, quote, being in school. But it doesn't take them long to figure out, like, holy moly, I don't have my community anymore, the place that I felt most comfortable. So that's an adjustment. And creating a social environment, I would say the biggest challenge for us as a society is creating social environments for developmentally different people who are no longer in their school, where they can meet one another and develop relationships and practice all of the different skill acquisition that they need, that all their peers age peers are practicing. And then I worry that the other challenge is that if there's not access to good role models, and if you don't have social networks, then you begin to develop negative coping mechanisms. So we have to try to intervene and prevent that, because prevention is always better than trying to cure. Now, I'm going to emphasize some of the other themes that I've gathered from my own work, as well as talking to colleagues and obviously reading, again, these sources, these interesting sources. I do see a group of ASD youth that experience what we would call profound alienation. Okay? That doesn't mean all do, because many are happy. But when it comes to the issue of alienation, what I think the alienation that many people in the young adult, so many young adults feel alienated, that may be part and parcel, at least temporarily, of the progress through young adulthood. But the kind of alienation that we see with kids on the spectrum include things like being disengaged or distrusting of the outside world, that somehow the outside world isn't safe, isn't a good place, and people are going to hurt you or going to reject you, or you're going to get lost in it somehow. So what that tends to lead to, and what I try and figure out with the people I'm working with, is, number one, is there an over-reliance on avoidance and or escapism? And what do kids escape into most nowadays? What's the favorite form? What? Video games and online, yeah, online everything, right? Like just hanging out there because that's okay. Going to a program or going to a job where people might hold you accountable or where you have to do some things that are difficult, not for me. So some of them choose, not necessarily consciously, but find a way to escape. And the other thing that I worry about is that they develop a marginalized identity, that and others have reported it as, I mean, one of the greatest brilliant sociologists, actually one was teaching at Penn for many years, Irving Goffman, talked about identities of people who were deviant in some way, okay, and different in a negative way. And he looked at people with mental illness, he looked at people who were incarcerated, he looked at people with developmental differences. who each and all whose identities, as viewed by the rest of society, was to be marginalized from the mainstream. And the question really is how do we accept that this is a risk for many of our kids? And that we want to make sure that we support and empathize them. You can't ignore, I can't ignore it when a kid says to me, why should I make friends, Dr. Rostain? Why should I go to that social skills group? What's the point? What am I going to get out of it? And finally, you know, in the more extreme examples then of this, the challenges is that kids can become stressed or distressed or symptomatic and suffer in their symptomatic states from anything from apathy and indifference to loneliness and depression, anxiety, and OCD and PTSD. These are all of the part and parcel of what I work with and what, you know, the kinds of diagnoses that kids and adults come with. Noncompliance, anger, and aggression. All of these are forms, in my view, of expressions of distress and of having trouble adapting to the challenges of being in this stage of life. Okay, and especially if the balance between support and stress is tipping much, much more in the direction of stress. There's no way you can avoid stress. But if the stress is too great, it tends to, and isn't dealt with, it leads to distress. Okay, so any questions so far before we talk about executive function? Is this making sense? That, you know, there's both, you know, like I see the nods. Okay, I just want to make sure because I like interaction. Okay, I'm a relational type of person. So, okay, well, if you look at this is taken from the teenage brain. So you've got here the Facebook lobe, you know. And it used to be called the MySpace lobe, but it's now called the Facebook lobe. There's the texting lobe. That's a big one. Then there's the old people are so clueless lobe. Then there's the Red Bull repository right down there. And it's the part that wants to fit in. That's over there. There's the spinal cord that leads the rest of the body. Then there's the digital down lobe. I like that one, the digital down lobe. And finally, the twilight lobe. It's okay. So it used to be grown. They say it's mutated from the Harry Potter lobe. It moves from Harry Potter into Twilight. Okay. So all right, those are I am going to talk about executive functions though, because it will help you to understand why many people on the spectrum have trouble with this agenda of growing up, okay? Because growing up requires you to be able to carry out complex executive functions. So the simplest, earliest definition that Russell Barkley gave us in '97, and I remember when this book came out, it was very exciting to me because I was sort of starting to get my feet wet as a young faculty member, and I said, wow, you know, it's not about ADHD, it's about self-control. And in a way, that's really the key for me of the problems that I see in many of my patients. Whatever their developmental diagnosis has to do with the common feature of the difficulty of being able to self-regulate. So the earliest definition was self-directed actions of the individual that are being used to self-regulate. So what is executive function? Ability to self-regulate, right? And you start when you're a baby, you don't have a lot of it. And then as you get older, you're able to better and better self-regulate. Therefore, your executive functions are getting more and more sophisticated. And hopefully, that continues through time. A little bit later, Dr. Barkley gave us a little more sophisticated definition, but I think this is a beautiful, succinct way of saying that executive function is self-regulation, like you said, across time to choose, enact, and sustain actions toward a goal, usually in the context of others, and often relying on social and cultural means for the maximization of one's long-term welfare as that person defines it to be. So executive functions are all of those things that allow us to navigate through space and time to a distant goal that means something to us within a matrix called the social world. Okay? That is a tough, it is amazing that we pull it off. And I would say lots of people never get there, or some of them get there and then stop, really using this because they kind of think they can just coast once they get to adulthood. But believe it or not, in our modern world, as you all know, we have to do this every day. We've got to get our executive functions in line, especially with all of the new stuff we have to learn. I'm still learning how to enter information on our electronic medical record. Who would have expected at 60 years of age, 4 years ago, I had to learn how to write charts that I'd written for 30 years by hand. I suddenly had to learn how to put it all together in this little electronic thing. So I still am learning. I still have to employ my executive functions to get myself through my day. And I know all of you are too. So in other words, it's not like once you have it, you have them forever. You have to keep practicing. Okay? Now, if you really want to know the quickest way to say how good is your executive function, the simple answer is how efficient are you in getting your things done? And if you're pretty efficient, then you have pretty good executive function. People who are inefficient, we tend to say, maybe something's wrong with some aspect of your executive functioning. And I'm sorry, let me just go back a slide. Barclay's gone on to talk a little bit about how we manage time, how we organize ourselves around problem solving, how we can restrain ourselves, inhibit our behavior, how we keep ourselves motivated, and how we handle our emotions. So there are actually, within this notion of executive function, there are probably 5 domains. So what are the effects of these executive functions? What do they let us do? Well, first of all, and this is really important, is that this allows us to guide our behavior according to something called time. Time is, a really pretty abstract idea. But to know that not just, well, what time is Rostain over? He's like going on and on. But more like, how did you all get here in time? And where did we fit in this complex orchestrated day that you had that allowed you to manage time? Time and managing time is a critically complicated but important executive function. The next thing that these let us do is to decrease the amount of time we spend on irrelevant behavior, like fooling around or daydreaming and getting on task. By the way, we all need to be off task. Okay, it turns out your brain needs it. If you're on task all the time, you poop out. So actually, as you're sitting here, every couple of seconds, your brain is kind of going into the default mode, then it's coming back in, and it's coming back out, about 15, 20-second intervals. But you don't notice because you can sort of, there's a flow to this, right? But what you will notice is that every few minutes, you'll kind of daydream about something else, and that's just your brain rebooting and letting itself stay focused on the moment. So no one's persistently attentive every single second of every day, okay? But the more executive functions you have, the more you can direct yourself to the thing that you want and not the things you don't want. So this allows you to increase how much future-directed action you can pull off. It also lets you to get to more complicated behaviors. It also lets you learn by watching other people. We call that vicarious learning. It also lets you invent new ways of doing things. So you can come up with novel solutions instead of just doing the same old, same old. And here's where I see a lot of the problems in the kids that I work with. Motivation. Going even when you're not being rewarded. Staying engaged. Okay? So that's, goal-directed persistence. Also, being able to be flexible. Like if it isn't working out for you, how about not doing it that way? How about trying it a different way? So flexibility and motivation, big challenges for kids on the spectrum. Not all. mean, certainly they're very motivated for the things that are their interests. It's about, how about being motivated to take a shower, you know? Hey, can I get you to do that? No. Too busy. Okay? Or, you know what? We can't go to your favorite place today. We got to go somewhere else. Why? I won't do that other thing. Okay? Another thing that our executive functions allow us to do is when we're interrupted to get back to work and get to doing. And like I said, time management is key. Being able to manage your behavior better over time in accordance to learning what you need to do. Okay? Now, you don't need to know all this in depth, but the general gist is that all of these depend on neurocircuitry being intact. And we now can, in fact, say with great certainty, even though, by the way, before we had neuroimaging, the great neurologists figured these things out because they saw people with damage to these different parts of the brain, and they said, oh, look at that. You damage this part of the brain, you lose your sense of time. You damage that part of the brain, and you lose your social, emotional connection to people. So there were many studies that were case studies in the 19th and 20th century. In fact, there were some that date back to this, believe it or not, to the 18th century. Very elegant case studies. But sooner or later, the map has been drawn of the brain, and we now can look at the living brain and we say, yeah, look, executive function in these particular prefrontal regions here, the regulation of emotion or affect is in this part here, and the ability to pay attention and inhibit our actions in these structures here. Okay? So all of these structures need to be online and in sync, or else you don't have the ability to sustain attention or inhibition of impulses, or managing your emotion, or problem solving. So all of these functions that I've been describing to you presuppose a neural circuitry that's, for the most part, working okay. We know also from studies that people with neurodevelopmental differences, you know, they don't have a hole in this part of the brain. It's just that the connections don't work as well. The signals don't transmit as efficiently, or maybe other signals come in that shouldn't be there. Okay? Or certain circuits fire and then need to stop, but no, they don't stop, so they keep going around and around. And these are called the loops that people get stuck in. They're loops. I can't get out of this loop. All right? So, I mean, again, not to spend a lot more time on it, let's just say that all of these ideas, all of these things I'm telling you about, and executive functioning being that ability to do problem solving that requires you to, all of those things are very vulnerable to developmental differences, to injury, to disease, and to things like stress, alcohol. I mean, think of it. You know, I always tell medical students, I say, well, if you want to know what it's like to really, you know, have trouble paying attention, tell me how well it was you were able to pay attention after you got loaded and you were, you know, you were trying to listen to a friend talking on and on and on about a thing you were not very interested in. Do you remember anything about what they said? No. So when you're loaded, when your alcohol is flooding this part of your brain, these circuits don't work so well. Same with weed, same with all other kinds of substances people find access to. So that's one example. Another is sleeplessness. Perfect thing. Talk about paying attention or sustaining motivation. How well can you do that when you haven't slept? Not too well, right? So we know in all human beings there are times when we can't sustain this. That's why we fall asleep. Okay. So the other thing to keep in mind, and I always say this with great respect for the fact that it isn't one circuit that doesn't work. Okay, and all the circuits are interconnected. And when we think about not just executive functioning, but the social emotional development that we want young people to have as they move towards adulthood, we want them to have the ability to control their impulses. And here's the big one, thinking through the consequences of actions. And legion the number of times that I hear the thing about well, I didn't expect that to happen. And parents saying, well, what did you expect was going to happen? I don't know. You know, I just thought it would be all right. Problem solving, flexibility, being able to think of alternative. So what does it mean when you're inflexible? How can you get someone who's inflexible to consider another problem, another perspective? Okay, and speaking of perspective, there's the social perception and there's the ability to impact and be attuned. Now these deficits that we see in people on the spectrum, again, they're not all uniform, they're not all equally impairing, but when you have these challenges through self-regulation, problem-solving, social perception, empathy, and attunement, it just means that what others perceive you to be is much less adult-like. And if they do see you as an adult who has this, they may misinterpret you as being what? Lazy, selfish, arrogant, aloof, weird, bizarre, unfriendly. So the fact is that these internally constructed capacities, if they are not being fully expressed the way others are expecting of you, then you get into the difficulty, which is why I think, for example, strategies and like, Melita's saying, is expanding the skill set on the one hand, but also just educating the community that, not everybody who refuses to talk when being asked a question is being rude. Maybe the person isn't talking when asked a question because they have a developmental difference. But the world might interpret them as being, in some way undesirable. Okay, and so then the last thing I'll say about all the neuroscience is that we now have the ability to carry out, I think, good assessments of these functions to help us, most of all, to kind of help us guide what new technologies, what approaches we're going to use to help the person in some other way achieve greater and greater success. Okay? So does this make sense so far where we're going with this? Okay. So if you're missing these, if you have these executive functions that are not working out, and this one is one of my favorites. Stephen Wright says, right now I'm having amnesia and deja vu at the same time. I think I've forgotten this before. You ever had that feeling? Like you say, God, I know I forgot this before. It's not just, so deja vu and amnesia at the same time, right? So the fact is that when we go back to these executive functions, we see problems with variability in reaction time and in motor sequencing and in working memory. Working memory being what your little scratch pad that keeps you on track. And this one's important, diminished flexibility of responding and temporal discounting of future rewards, meaning I'll keep doing this now because it feels right. Forget that, I might get a bigger reward later. Not ready to, I discount the later reward and get for the immediate reward, okay? And I mentioned before, time is not easy to manage. Problem solving, not being able to see the errors, not being able to listen and read efficiently and organize and sustain motivation. And here's a good one, a illusory bias. And by that we mean a positive illusory bias. Many people with executive function deficits, they overestimate how easy it's going to be to get something done. And I don't need to learn that. Oh, no, I know that already. No sweat, no problem. And guess what? They're wrong. Now there are those who have a negative illusory bias. They're the ones who are afraid. They won't do anything because they think no matter what, and I'm going to talk about those because that's a big issue. They fear failure. And they will be very tough because they interpret every change as, uh-oh, catastrophe awaits. Right. So that's the problem, is that negative or positive bias that's sustained, you need to have a little of both. You need to be kind of like, sometimes I'm positive, sometimes I'm negative, sometimes I'm right in the middle. because that allows me to both try things that I might not be good at, but it also makes me cautious in places I need to be cautious. And the other important finding from the literature, from longitudinal studies, is that if you start off with whatever your neurodevelopmental disorder is, and you have these executive deficits, then what it leads to is poor organization, difficulty with adaptive functioning, and then what happens is you get this reduced practice and avoidance. And that's what people call secondary executive functioning deficit, because you never get to practice, since you're avoiding using these functions. And that's why, for example, not having chores, your mother buttering the bread, it's kind of an interesting symbiotic relationship there, right? The kid never had to learn, and it kind of gives mom a sense of, well, at least I'm doing something for my kid. It's a natural thing. Well, we have to be careful. Just because there's a weakness in an area doesn't mean you don't try to get people to practice. And I used to do this, it's a silly example, but you remember when you were kids, you used to try to write with the opposite hand, like your left hand. Right? Now, I wrote with my right hand, and my left-handed penmanship was terrible until one summer I said to myself, I'm going to practice writing with my left hand. You know what? By the end of the summer, it was pretty good. Didn't look quite as good. I was never quite as fast. But there was definitely improvement, which I never, ever, ever would have gained had I not deliberately made the choice to learn how to write left-handed. Well, I would submit to you all that this is what we have to figure out, how to give people with executive functioning deficits, how to get to practice some of these areas that are difficult, whether it's time management, problem solving. Big one that I would like to see practice more is flexibility. How about changing those socks, huh? Let's see what we get out of doing that. How about changing your look? Okay, and above and beyond those executive function deficits that I mentioned before, what's even more specific to kids on the spectrum as opposed to other neurodevelopmental disorders is this difficulty with social cues and language, the desire for sameness and routine, problems with impulse control, hyper-focusing, hyper or hypoactivity, and this is really interesting, sorting out the wheat from the chaff. And this is something that I'm learning all the time. I continue to learn that people cannot assume that someone else knows what's relevant and what's irrelevant. Okay? And the person may get stuck on something very irrelevant when that wasn't the most important part of the message. There are nice scales out there. So again, if you're thinking about how do I prepare and figure out what's what with my family member who's on the spectrum, there are both scales and tests. These are some examples of them. I'm not going to go through each one. But it turns out that if you want to measure the impairment that comes from an executive function, you're better off using the scales than you are the tests. Because the tests don't predict occupational and life functioning as well as the scales do. They cost a lot more and they predict a lot less. So, which isn't to say I'm not saying you shouldn't get neuropsych testing, but if you really want to figure out executive function problems, then just ask people about them. And it turns out that these are very, very good predictors of occupational difficulties. And they're better also at predicting life impairments. So just as a sort of take a sidestep for a moment before I go into the next discussion, I do think that wherever we are as those of us in the professional world, we need to have a systematic way of developing with families and individuals an intervention plan, which means first and foremost, you have to educate about not just the ASD, but this part. And that's what I see is missing a lot in the world. Is like everybody's quick to say, well, ASD is this and ASD is that. But what you really is most impairing for some of my patients isn't the ASD part. It's the executive functioning part. It's the managing your time or getting from A to Z in a system, or the A to B, I should say, in a systematic way. And then looking at strengths, at weaknesses, setting expectations, finding out the resources, and then using as many places as you can, reasonable accommodations. And I believe in the executive function oriented CBT, which we've been working on here at Penn. So just as this is my only self-promotion slide. My colleague Russ Ramsey, a psychologist, and I, based on, again, 16 years of working together with adults with ADD and other developmental problems, we came up with a toolkit. And this toolkit is designed to help people with executive functioning deficits. It's all about using CBT to facilitate coping. Okay, and what is in our coping list? And this is what we think of as the key areas. And I'm going to focus on getting started because I think procrastination is a big one. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. But this book works through, and any clinician who knows anything about working with people with executive function deficits knows that you got to do things like helping people develop a to-do list and a daily planner and prioritization and breaking down tasks. And once you get started, to keep going and to figure out how to keep yourself motivated and how to dealing with your escape behaviors and the thoughts that stop you from succeeding, and doing like outsource coping, which is sometimes it is good to give other people something to do instead of you. Okay, and I could go through this whole list, but all I'm going to say is you got to start small. You got to pick one thing and do it and practice it and get better at it, and people can do that. The problem is when they try to do all of this all at once, they feel defeated. So you have to decide. Now, another important aspect of treating executive function deficits is that it's really important to externalize important information at point of performance, and like externalizing time and time periods and breaking up things into small tasks and externalizing the sources of motivation and of mental problem solving. And by this we mean having little guideposts that tell you you're on the right track. Good job. That each task that we might think of as taking on requires externalized cues. And we do this with language impaired people and help them with visual cues for language. The same is true for executive function deficit. Instead of saying, I'm going to get from here to there with no map, what these external cues are maps, but maps that are out in the world. So basically I kind of construct it as an arrow that says go this way and another arrow that says don't go this way. Okay, that keeps people moving through the world in a step-by-step fashion. One other important area, and this is for those of you who are interested in sort of the mind of people with executive function problems, is they tend to magnify, they have what we call the magnification minimization cognitive error. They tend to magnify how hard it's going to be, how long it's going to take, how uncomfortable they're going to feel doing something, and they minimize what they might actually be able to do and how much they might actually benefit from taking the task on. So if you think about it, what gets us to do something is when the positive to negative ratio changes in the balance of positive. It's like we're all designed to go or stop, and when you're not sure and you're standing there back and forth, you're procrastinating. Okay? Whenever someone says, I was thinking about doing this, but I still didn't, you're procrastinating. Because you're really not engaging, you're kind of weighing. Now, we need to procrastinate a little bit. A little procrastination is normal. But when we're talking about people who spend hours and hours trying to decide, should I put on this pair of shoes or put on that pair of shoes, the net result is that they're really not getting with the task, okay? The other thing we try to give people a chance to do is to learn how to challenge the negative and come up with a defense attorney that says, hey, you know what, don't listen to that prosecutor, you can do this. Don't listen to that accusatory voice inside of yourself that says you're going to fail. Because you know what? You don't really know if you're going to fail or not. Maybe it'll work out. So I'm not going to spend too much time, but we have these behavioral interventions that get people to describe the scripts that they're trying to change, and we then try to come up with a new script. And before we get going, we say, what do you have to do, and how would you program a robot to do it? And people on the spectrum like that one, because they're good at programming robots, in the sense of, well, I would tell a robot to do this first, then this, then this, then this. Okay? Now, they may not be able to do it on their own. They may need someone to coach them through each step. But the important point here is that when you make the task manual and you say you're going to start at this time and end at this time, there's a greater likelihood that you're going to get to the end in a reasonable time. And the time should be reasonable time. It can't be 2 hours cleaning up your room. Okay? So I'll tell you about the 10-minute rule in a moment. The final point is that we use this approach called implementation intentions, which is, like I said, creating environmental cues to guide you. All right? Okay. And so before you get started, though, you remember that which step, it's almost like the little engine that could, only that sounds a little too corny when you're talking to young adults. They don't want to hear about the little engine that could. But that's my favorite childhood story. Because when you say you think you can enough times, it might get you up that hill. I think I can is what we call manufacturing emotion and motivation. Okay? But you have to ask yourself honestly, with any task in your life, where are you? Are you at the step of I won't do it, or I can't do it, or I want to do it? How do I do it? I'll try to do it. I can do it. I will do it. I did it. Okay, this is kind of what we call them stages of change in the psychological literature, but that's really what it boils down to. This is like the pre-contemplation or denial, like, I won't do that. So when I talk to you in a moment about procrastination, I'm not talking about the person who doesn't want to change their procrastination, because that's not going to work. Nobody's going to stop procrastinating if procrastinating works for them and they don't ever have to face a task. All right? And this happens a lot. I see a lot of my patients who've successfully worn their parents out because the parents get tired of saying, will you please take a shower? And so they go later, 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 and they never have to take the shower, and then boom, they just keep doing that because the script is working for them. So it's when the script isn't working, because procrastination actually can be exhausting when you do want to get something done, but you're still procrastinating. So in the case of the definition I'm using, is taken from Steele's paper. Procrastinate is to voluntarily delay an intended course of action despite expecting to be worse off for the delay. Okay? So you know you shouldn't be putting this off, but you're doing it anyway. And there's lots of different facets to it. You know, everybody says, well, you're just lazy. No, there's more to it than that. Okay? Some people procrastinate because it doesn't really bother them that they didn't take a shower. That's called low conscientiousness. You know, so what? So what if I didn't do it? Who cares? There are people who really don't know how to regulate themselves and even be aware of the time that they need to get something done. And they're distracted and disorganized. There's a problem with motivation, meaning I'm not sure I can do it. Impulsiveness, fear of failure. Okay, so these are all facets, and like I said, each person's got to look at their own procrastination tendencies, and the way we've defined it is there's sort of three main things that we work with in our program. One is just deferring all the time, and that's kind of like a habit. It's like, nah, not now. It's almost like an automatic response. I hear this a lot with the request to do the chores. Not now. When? Later. Okay? That's the deferring. Then there's losing track. Some people literally forget that they got to get something done until it's like the last minute. And finally, somebody just says, I know I should do it, but I'm underwhelmed. Meaning, I don't really care. It doesn't matter to me. And that kind of procrastination actually is very hard to deal with. We have to get into, well, what would it take to make it matter? I always like to say, what if you got $50 for taking a shower? Would you take a shower? Not that we should give them $50, but it's just like a little bit of an exercise in what's it worth it to you? You know, it's sort of like making them an offer they can't refuse. So this is the procrastinator's work week. Monday, don't count. Tuesday, it's only Tuesday, I'll do it tomorrow. Wednesday, it's midweek. I should get started in a bit. I still have tomorrow, Friday. Whoopee, it's Friday, I'll do it Monday. Now, do you detect in there, that is what we call the rationalization, the mindset that people have as procrastinators. They can always come up with a reason to put it off. So, what we try to do is get people to say, let's talk about something you're procrastinating that you want to stop procrastinating about. What is it? What are your thoughts about doing the task? And we ask, in what ways are you magnifying the negative aspects? Because that's inevitable. Okay? Oh, it's such a pain. Think of, you do this as a thought experiment now. Just think about something you're procrastinating about, and you procrastinate a lot. What are the thoughts you have about that task? Yes, exactly. So you start to magnify how painful it's going to be, right? Oh, I'm going to have to, and then you say, okay, you labeling the feelings is basically, in your case actually, it's I'm going to be reminded of something painful. Okay, anybody else want to share a thought? Yeah. Ugh. Okay, remember that. Ugh is the feeling you get when you say to yourself, this is going to be hard, it's going to take forever. Ugh. And what do these feelings do to your motivation to do the task? They tend to make you procrastinate more. Why? Because when you say, I'll do it later, you no longer have to face the painful thought or feelings. You don't have to face the exhaustion. You don't have to do anything. You know why? That's what's so powerful about procrastinating. It takes away that negative feeling you had based on the negative thought you had about the task itself. So what do you have to do to reverse this? Well, we start to think about like, hey, why is this important to you? Why would it be good for you to organize those papers or send off? What are you going to get? Okay? And think about the positive aspects about your ability to face the task. You can do that. You know you can. So you have to actually start to maximize the gain you'll get. And then, especially, not just when you're doing it, but how good is that going to feel to have that off your back? How good is it going to feel to see that pile of papers off your desk or your counter? Okay? And you might even think about not only how good you'll feel, but what you're going to do to reward yourself for doing it. Like, I promise I'm going to go to that movie I've been wanting to go to, or whatever it is, when I get that done. Okay? Then the next step will be, of course, to break down the task into a small step, and then invest a few moments of discomfort as you take this step, and you know that you're going to not like it. But as long as you take one step, instead of doing 100 cards, 5 cards. Okay? So that gets us to the 10-minute rule. The 10-minute rule is anybody can do something they don't like for 10 minutes. So define what you can do. In the case of a pile of papers, let's see how many papers I'm going to set a timer, and I'm just going to go through for 10 minutes. Boom, I'm done. And what will happen is, we say 10 minutes. Some people can do it for 15 minutes. You might say, oh, I can do it for 20 minutes. Fine, whatever you decide. At least 10 minutes, and devote this 10 minutes, good faith effort, and then reassess. So you are not only are you no longer procrastinating, you actually got the onerous thing started. And guess what? You might decide after 10 minutes, I might as well keep going. Okay? You might not. You might say, 10 minutes, that's enough. God, that Rostain, he's driving me crazy. But then what you have to do is you have to schedule the next 10 minutes. Okay, another 10 minutes tomorrow or later today. And guess what? The second 10 minutes is usually easier to get going on than the first 10 minutes because we always maximize how hard it's going to be. And not uncommonly, people will go longer than 10 minutes. If not the first time, the second or the third. Now, everybody makes fun of the fact that, frankly, I was expecting a little more sophisticated than this, Dr. Rostain. Just give me a little carrot hanging in there. Is that all there is to motivation? Well, it turns out you do need to give yourself rewards. You really do. And I say this to all of my patients, that, you may not get a merit badge for it, but you need to kind of keep yourself clear about what you're going to gain from doing it, and what can you do that will be pleasant to you to keep you not only motivated to start, but then to go back and keep going, okay? Right, playing it safe, I'm not going to do it. So with those individuals, you actually have to role play out and try to get them to experience their anxiety in a tolerable way. And sometimes we'll do that in the office. Like if they're like I had a guy who was avoiding writing a paper, and he really had always learned, he was afraid of failure. So I literally had him bring in, and we worked on the outline together. Now I wasn't doing it for learning as a learning specialist. I was doing it to help him identify how his anxiety, he could actually fight against his anxiety. So what I didn't get into is that everybody has discomfort, not just about things that are procrastinating, even worse. And the point is that you have to not let the feeling of anxiety stop you from at least taking a couple of steps into the water. How far they go, it's about the, do you jump in the pool full, or you just, like, I always give patients the choice. Are you going to dip your toe and let your toe get used to the water, or do you just want to run headlong in and see what it's like? And people who are afraid know if they're ready to take on, the question is this person ready to take on the anxiety? And then we make it a whole task around avoidance based on fear. That would be a good follow-up conversation to have about a specific situation, but anxiety and fear-based responses are learned. And what they need to do is to be unlearned. And the only way you can unlearn it is to expose the person to the fear and realize that it doesn't kill you. And the problem with a lot of our approaches, both in education and in the rest of the parenting world, is that everybody sees the anxiety as an enemy, whereas I think anxiety is a signal. It's like any other signal. You feel anxiety, so sit with that. What does that mean? And then you get into the catastrophic. Person has to be ready to talk about all the catastrophic thinking they have, and then we pull out and say, oh, look at catastrophic thinking. This is what keeps you from doing anything, because you have this catastrophic scenario in your head. If you have a carrot for a rabbit, the rabbit will go for the carrot. But if you have a little snake out in front of the carrot, that rabbit ain't going to go for that carrot. That snake is there. Not me. I'm not going to get eaten by a snake. So you have to say, let's move that snake out of the way. How does the carrot look now? Because as long as there's, and I believe that. I believe that people are seeing snakes everywhere, and I'm not going to say they're not there. I'm going to say, how can I help you move the snake away? Okay. So now are we all together on this? Is this okay? So notice adulthood ahead, please exit now. Say dad and mom. All right. I think that there's sort of basics, and Melita, I'm expanding on something Melita said earlier, and I'm sure you've heard this before, but this all begins with creating and setting reasonable personal and vocational goals and expectations. Anything and everything has to be set in a reasonable way, but that means it has to be slightly a stretch, because if it's too easy and too comfortable, then nobody's going to make the change. This is the example you gave earlier. Buttering your own bread. Let's get going with that. My favorite one is getting yourself up in the morning. And I can't tell you how many people show up, they want to go to college, they do not get up in the morning on their own. And they don't know how to go to bed at night either. Two big ones. So let's set a realistic expectation. Let's see how you can do learning to get to wake up in the morning, or learning to get to sleep, whatever it is. You cannot expect that that's going to happen right away. You need a learning ramp. Lifestyle choices, I can't say enough about this. is for every minute on the computer, maybe you ought to be spending a minute on the treadmill or on the elliptical. Make it a trade. Yeah, you can go on that computer, sure. But I want to see that you spend equal number of minutes walking. Big expectation, but that's lifestyle. All right? Because what ends up happening is we do what our lifestyles let us get away with. And truth be told, I think all human beings to some extent are lazy, in the sense that that's how we were programmed. We were programmed to find the simplest way to get what we want with the least amount of effort. Once we get that, we're good. Okay? Now, I'm not saying we're only lazy, because we're not just lazy. There's another part of us that's very industrious and creative and wants to, it gets tired with the too easy. When it's too easy, that's why I think the people who design these video games are brilliant. They understand human behavior, unbelievable. They know how to make it just hard enough to keep you engaged, but not so hard that you fail and give up. And then as soon as you get good, what do? They make it harder. What? Yeah, they make a new one, or they make the new level, right? You got to go from level to level. And that is learning, right? So what you really think about is, and people are talking about this, I don't have the greatest examples yet, but they're coming your way, is gamification of learning life. It's gamification. That's the name of the game. To turn learning how to take care of yourself into a game. And there are now apps coming out, like gamifying getting to class on time. Like for college students with ADD, there's an app now. You basically get in there, boom, you start off with a score, and then you actually get points, and you're competing with people to get to class on time. This is for people who are late all the time. Okay? To me, that's cool. You know why? Because it does two things. Number one is externalizes. Here's my game. You want to know what my game? I'll come clean. I've got a little Fitbit on here. Tells me how many steps I walk. And guess what? My wife and I and a couple of my friends, we all know how many steps each other takes each day. So I get zapped by my wife, like, "Oh, you didn't walk too much today, Tony. What's up with you?" Or, "Ha ha ha, I walk more than you. Ha ha ha." So Fitbit now has got me walking more. When I come in, I don't take the elevator go up the stairs. I walk up 3 flights because I know that I'm counting those steps. That's an example of gamification that now allows me to get moving on an agenda. Yeah, I think YouTube and the internet this is the best time in history to be on the spectrum, because you're not just alone and just in your own space. You can move into the world, and I think there's a YouTube, like they say there's an app for it, there's also a YouTube video for it, like learning everything. Again, what we want is to help people foster independence in the vocational and living, and you're going to hear about this in future workshops. So the workshops are all aimed at things like healthy lifestyle, independence in vocational and living, positive social relationships, that's the one I'm going to come back with and we'll talk about, overcoming challenging behaviors, and treating emerging mental disorders. Okay? So the assessment, and I hope you've had this at some point, because it's now mandated, as kids reach the end of their high school years, in their 20s now, between around age 19, it should already be in place. Maybe even better at 17, but okay. And this includes then looking at all of the different options, the career and vocational plans, readiness for college or for work, for independent living, for support structures, and this is a key, the fit between the expectations the youth has for themselves and their abilities, and the youths and the families and the community's resources. The fit needs to be as good as possible. I can't tell you, there's one guy who I couldn't believe, he's going to become a computer designer, like computer animation. And he was in a very special school, and he could, guess what? He worked hard as could be. He got a job at Disney World selling Disney World products, because this is his interest, is Disney. Not only did he get a job at Disney and become so good at it, but they knew he was interested in animation. The Disney animation group kind of had him come in and hang out just as a, and then they helped him go to community college down in Florida. And then he kept working at Disney World, selling merchandise, but getting more, exposure. And now he, believe it or not, got into a college computer animation school. But it took him, he is now 24, and most of his peers have already, most of his age mates have already graduated college and are actually well along. But he doesn't care, because what he did was he said, this was my goal, and we figured out how to get a fit between his goals and the little steps to get there. Okay, so I can't say that more, and I'm not going to say too much more about this, but this ITP has to be part of the solution for people. This is my map, the individual transition plan. It's what gets you from here to there. And all the things I mentioned. And you need a planning team, and that's part of what the resource list that Gail's mentioning is on the little stick, okay? And I know that Ascend for years has been doing. I mean, the idea that you need a team and the people need to work together with those teams. And then I'm going to end my last few minutes with family empowerment. So it's called FYI Transition, and I'm going to get you to. There's for parents and for families, for professionals. Let's go to the one for students, okay? And I just want to show you what you do when you get there, because this is a very thoughtful way to help people. It's going to take a second to boot up. Okay, so here we go.
Hi, this is Mark. This is a website for students to explore ideas about transition from school into getting a job. Click on any of the links at any time to learn about a topic. To start, try clicking on Kate, and she will introduce you to transition and show you a brief movie about other students with disabilities who got jobs.
Welcome. My name is Kate, and I am a high school student who happens to have a disability. In this brief training, I will talk to you about transition, moving from school to adult life. Students like me, with support from their families and teachers, have high expectations for their future adult lives. Beginning as early as desired, but at least by age 14, young adults should be considering our next steps in life. What kind of work will you contribute? Where and how will you live? Who will be your friends, and what will you do for fun?
Couldn't have said it better myself. Okay? So there's all kinds of resources here: managing your health, your money, self-employment, more education. And it's all web-based YouTube format. Okay? And I'm just really thrilled to have these kinds of resources now showing up more and more, because then once you direct the kids to them, they can learn what they want and go wherever they want from there. So that's their other comment here. Many times youth with disabilities, because of the vulnerabilities that some experience, do not get to explore enough options and make enough choices. But self-determination teaches us that the road to a successful adulthood includes the ability to be autonomous. Autonomy is not a skill that comes natural to everyone. You have to realize that you have to control, be able to understand yourself and what you can do and want to do, and be able to express yourself. This is the key to self-determination. To me, this is as clear a statement that we can give kids starting to enter that phase we call emerging adulthood, or late adolescence to adulthood. That how do we help you become self-determining? But it's not a God-given right. You have to earn this. You have to, like independence for our country, or any group of people's independence has to be fought for. They have to take it on and say, in order to get there, I have to do some things. And that's my big question always when I have kids come to see me who are sitting around and not moving forward. I always say, is this the way you want to express your self-determination? If you're happy with it, that's one thing. If you're not happy with it, you've got to have to make some changes. So when it comes to how we work and how you work in this as families, I think that there's no question that we want to see you empowered. We want to see you part of the solution. But it's as Melita set up so beautifully, you got to figure out, how are the roles being assigned and who's getting burned out. And I think setting up contracts and rights and responsibilities is part of it, making explicit what people are expecting. Okay? Now, some of the challenges for doing this are as follows. Number one, the youth. What is the youth's belief system? What are they, how ready are they, and what do they think they should be doing, and how do they identify themselves? What do you see for yourself? It has to start like that. It has to start with, who are you and what do you see for yourself? What do you want for yourself? Now, there are lots of times where there's conflicts between what the youth wants and what the family wants. I'm going to spend a moment on that because it's pretty complicated, right? Then, this one's a biggie. Not getting enough of the sorts of, I see a lot, it's fascinating to me, and I don't know if I can prove this, but the more able an ASD kid is, the less they use the support services. And I don't know if that's because that, to them, support services means I'm not like everyone else, but there are legions of great books, and we had what from Wolf from the college. Jane Thierfield Brown. I called her Wolf. Jane Thierfield Brown. She works with another doctor. Jane Thierfield Brown designs this great program. The problem, as she puts it, is a lot of kids don't want to use it because it identifies them as different. That's in the college domain. The same is true in the vocational domain. How ready, this is a big issue. And finally, all the bureaucracy, I don't even want to go there. That just gets me too upset and angry. So it's this one here says, Dad is talking to the son. He goes, young man, you'd better get my priorities straight. That's the parent conflict thing, right? And what are the conflicts? And I'm telling you, these are not, hopefully I'm saying this so that you don't feel so alone with all this. All right? Everything from not taking care of hygiene, poor eating habits, leaving a mess, not doing chores, staying up too late, sleeping all morning, morning hassles, spending too much time in their room or on the computer, too much anger, problematic sexual behavior, including online pornographic visits, and in some of my kids, risk-taking like smoking and illicit drugs. I have one kid, I'll never forget, he has gotten himself so close to being seriously arrested, and he's like smoking pot in public. And I say to him, why do you do that? He goes, well, everybody else does. It's his ticket to being like everybody else. Problem is, I said, well, yeah, but not everybody else does it like right across the street from a police car. You were overlooking something. So the motivation is, I get it. I get that motivation. I get it. So how do we help them and how do we deal with these conflicts, okay? So my view is that you got to do it on your own, but if you can't, then find someone like Melita. I mean, Melita does it. We work on a number of cases together. I do this in my own practice. The idea here is that everybody's got to get their input in here. Everybody's got input into the conversation. Everybody has an equal voice. And the resources and the strengths as well as the vulnerabilities, and everybody's got to come up with a solution. Because if I try to impose a solution on you and you don't buy it, I'm going to be frustrated and you're going to be frustrated. So where can we find a meeting ground? Where can we all agree and how can we build on there? And so this is a framework for conflict resolution. And basically, it's up to everyone to pull it together and come up with some positive steps. Now, I call them small steps in service of a bigger goal. That means that sometimes the parents have to give up some of their hopes for a moment in order to get the kid moving towards the direction that people want, okay? And I think that the other important message from my view of this is that, you know, these little wrens that build these nests. I don't know, we had a wren build a nest like this near our home. Anyway, they build it painstakingly. And it isn't done in all one step. It's accumulation of many, many painstaking little steps. But that's why perseverance is not a long race, it's many short races, one after another. There's now some evidence, too, that we may have been over-accommodating and over-scaffolding in some places. And that comes back, well, you're talking about this, which is, where can we get kids to also try and fail without feeling like failures? In other words, where is it safe to say, I'm going to try you out with waking yourself up? And if they come back and they've only woken themselves up once out of the week, that's one day they did it, rather than 6 days that they didn't. So part of this is reframing not only what were the missing steps, what were the things the person didn't learn, and therefore needs to take steps to learn, but every step taken is a success, rather than, oh, they failed 6 times, okay? And that's part of the deal, is why I think perseverance is an important thing to model. Now, the other thing that's fascinating is if you get into the mindset of people who are in their emerging adulthood, you know, they're all like having, you ever heard, I mean, one of my peers literally said, I'm 25, I'm having my quarter-life crisis. I said, are you kidding me? I mean, I went through my midlife crisis. I was proud of it. I earned my midlife crisis. How could you be going through your quarter-life crisis? One kid actually said to me, he was 20 years old, he said, I'm going through my quarter-life crisis. I said, you're only 20. He goes, yeah, but I'm not going to live past 80. I said, okay, how do you know? Can't keep calm, I'm a quarter century old here. I'm 30, live with my parents, now why won't you date me? Okay, so we do work individually with the youth as well, and we use this strategy that I was describing before, called cognitive behavioral therapy, which includes coming up with an understanding of the person's whole or life experiences, and we definitely focus on problem solving through experiential learning. That's what we do in our sessions. We try to experience what the obstacle is and then try to do problem solving around it. It isn't just talk. It's let's solve a problem, let's practice, okay? And do social experiments. You know, the world just isn't meeting my needs right now. This, I have to tell you, this transcends just kids on the spectrum, okay? But there is this tremendous question. What do you do when you're in this state? Where do you turn? What happens? And that's where I would say that we try to approach the core beliefs that we have to deal with, that our patients bring us. And some of the core beliefs, because you know what? I can tell, they could even they could make their own script up about how to overcome procrastination or how to start to take care of their time. They could tell you, like they wrote the book, what needs to be done to get the task done, and yet they're not doing it. And why are they not doing it? Because some deeper thought process is interfering. And again, I believe that these are core beliefs that have emerged through life experience. These are hard-earned, difficult to change, but not impossible to change beliefs. One of them is, I will be rejected, which means I'm undesirable, or I will be excluded, or I'm bad, or I can't trust myself to do the right thing. And out of these core beliefs come what we call the most common automatic negative thoughts. And I'm not going to have time tonight, and it's really like we have a whole course and a training program in cognitive therapy. But, you know, one of my teachers invented it, Dr. Beck. He basically got to thinking about what were the patients saying to themselves that got them into the messes they were in, whether they were depressed, anxious, whatever. And there are some common themes. One of them is all or nothing thinking. You know, if I don't get it right the first time, I'm a failure. All or nothing thinking is sometimes called black and white thinking, although I tend to just use the term all or nothing thinking. I prefer that term. Okay, which is to say, that's not how the world is. The world isn't all or nothing. There are part scores. You know, you can get, it's not like if you don't get everything right, if you don't get 100, you fail. But that's what all or nothing thinking is like. So with what you were saying, Melita, for people to go back and have to learn something that seems to them like beneath them, we need to say to them, well, why are you thinking like all or nothing about it? Why not just say, maybe that could be worth learning, instead of judgmental. No, no, no. Okay? Another one is magical thinking. That's like, if I wait, it'll happen on its own. That's one example. All kinds of other examples of magical thinking. Externalizing the blame. That's like, oh, it's because I have, Asperger's, I have autism, it's because I have ADD, it's because I have a learning disability, it's because. Okay? One of my patients who actually has been in recovery for 30 years says to me, that's the poor me, the poor me from the 12-step program. It's poor me, another one. Because you feel sorry for yourself enough, you end up wanting to medicate yourself with something. And so, I call this the pity party approach. And after a while, you have to say, look, you can keep doing this, it's not going to help things. And I'm not here to pity you. I'm here to help you get out of the rut that your pitying is keeping you in. Comparative thinking, that's like always saying, everybody else has it easier than me. Why do I have to have this? Everybody else is smarter, everybody else is better looking, everybody. Negative comparisons. Now, funny thing is, from research, we know that if you compare yourself to somebody who's better off than you, what do you think you feel about yourself? Yeah, right? What happens if you compare yourself to somebody who's worse off than you? You know what happens to you? You feel better. So occasionally I'll say, so you mean to tell me, living in the United States, where you've been immunized, we have a roof over your head, you think you'd be better off, living in Aleppo right now, or some other part of the world, without Asperger's? What would you rather have? Where you are, or living X place? And they look at me, I said, I'd rather be here. I said, comparative thinking in the other direction. Maybe you are better off than some people, you just don't realize it. Now, I don't say I don't do that every day, okay? Don't think of me as a tough guy. But the point is that what happens when you start to feel like I'm poor me and or everyone else has it easier is you really add to your disability rather than allowing yourself to fight back against it. Say, yes, I have this disability, but what am I going to do? So our goal is not to get rid of Asperger's, ADD, executive function. Our goal is not to eliminate them because we don't have it in our power to do that right now. We want to get rid of the interferent thing. Like if depression is interfering, yes, I want to treat the depression. If anxiety disorder is so bad that I can't even imagine a snake so that I can do an imaginal exposure to get rid of the snake, then maybe I need a medication for anxiety just to get me to the point where I can take the risk of imagining facing a snake. Once I can get the person to imagine it, that's the biggest challenge. Once they can imagine doing it, the next step is to practice in the room, and then to practice in the next, and in this hall outside the room, and eventually to practice in the world. So I like the notion that our approach is, when we try to help kids and families, is to talk about resilience. And I like this one. I'm going to graduate on time no matter how long it takes me. And if you think of Aaron Rostain, who was the guy who had to saw off his hand to get out of that rock that he was, they made a big movie about it. But looking back, what he says is, it doesn't have to be fun. Meaning, it wasn't fun going through it, but you know what? It doesn't have to be fun to end up saying it was okay. All right? So that plays against the notion that it's black and white. It doesn't have to be fun. So I will give us a few minutes for conversation because, wait a minute, I think I have, yeah, okay. Because I do want to hear from you guys. Since we're starting off this series, a couple of questions I'll throw out there. What are your for those of you that are parents, your biggest frustrations in your role, not with ADD, with ADSD, your roles most challenging, biggest successes, what have you found most helpful, and what other knowledge or resources do you need? So a lot of times, kids' problems with executive functioning are masked when they live at home because parents provide a scaffolding, a structure. And so do high school teachers. Like they'll tell you, oh, you know, you need to turn in the paper, and you don't turn in the paper, they'll say, okay, I'll give you an extension. None of that exists in the college setting. So yeah, what you're saying is that his executive function skills were okay with a lot of structure and scaffolding, but when you took away the scaffolding and he has to do it on his own, it's harder for him. And probably time and sleep and wake and all that is one place to start. How well is he doing a daily schedule? I mean, I would start with basics. Does he have a daily planner? Does he know when he's going to bed? Is he trying to learn how to manage all the distractions? Here he was able to do something, and now he doesn't see. So again, the thing to do would be to have a conversation with him and say, you know, well, what do you make of that? What's going on? And if his answer is, well, you know, I don't have to get up till later, the question is, well, do you need me to wake you up later then? Or can you do it on your own? And how much, the other question is how invested is he in doing it on his own? Because as we all know, when you go back home, you tend to want to let your mom and dad take care of you. So the slippage may be in part because he's no longer in campus where the others around him would be giving him the cue. He's at home and you go off to work and there's no one waking him up. So I have a great clock one of my patients just showed me that is a gangbuster. This guy is 32 years old. For 10 years he needed his mother or a roommate to wake him up until his roommate moved out on him and said, no, you know, I can't live here anymore. It's for a number of reasons. He actually roommate left because he wanted to live with his girlfriend. But my patient said, Dr. Rostain, I couldn't do this anymore. I don't know what to do. I found the clock of clocks. And it is one of these alert things that when it goes off, you do not sleep through it. And so he was able to find a piece of technology that wakes him up now. And his mom is thrilled because she's, you know, she's in her 60s. She doesn't want to be waking him up. And he doesn't need to be woken up anymore. But it took him 15 years out of being out of his home till he figured it out. But I would start with one simple idea with your son that says, I would like to see you learn how to do this. Would you be interested? Does the cognitive therapy change the pathway or just get people to work around them? And there's a little bit of both, okay? So for example, I don't think cognitive therapy can give you a sense of time if you don't have an intrinsic good sense of time. But I can teach you how to learn timepieces that keep you on track, like my example I just gave you. Now, eventually what cognitive therapy does do is it does rewire your brain, okay? And in some cases we've seen in some studies, like for example, cognitive behavioral therapy for OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder. They've had before and after treatment with medication, before and after treatment with therapy, and the same brain changes were seen from both. So some people would argue actually that the brain changes from the therapy last longer because when you take away the medication, the brain goes back to it, unless the person's learned. So what is it saying? It's saying two things. Number one, that therapy is a form of learning. It's just a specialized, individualized form of learning. It's individualized learning around thinking patterns and action patterns and feeling patterns, to alter those patterns in response to the challenges of life. And when the person practices, now this is the other piece, is that the therapy only works if the person practices the skills in between the sessions. Because if they just come in and talk about how they're feeling, that's not cognitive therapy. I mean, it's therapy. We call that supportive expressive therapy. Supportive expressive therapy is where people either can't do the cognitive therapy, it's too hard for them, they're too overwhelmed, or they're not ready. You know, they're not ready to do the work, so they just want to come in and explain how they're feeling and how their parents don't understand them, or how, you know, no one wants to go out on a date with them, et cetera, et cetera. we're not going to say, hey, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you doing the other therapy? We're saying, okay, let's hear what's going on. Let's support something about you dealing with this, right? But once the person's showing that they're ready, willing, and able to say, you know what, I don't like thinking this way. I want to change my way of thinking about this and feeling. Then the therapy begins. And as we know, I mean, we'd use a lot of this therapy for people with ADD. We don't tell them, oh, the therapy's going to get you to be less impulsive, but it'll help you to realize which situations you're in that might bring out your impulsivity or your inattention, and we also might give you more problem-solving skills. So you work around it a little bit, and but I don't want to claim that, I've rewired everyone's brain. Like, I'm not sure we can rewire certain of the connections, but we can strengthen the the positive kinds of connections in the brain. Well, Dr. Brodkin here is doing a study. Is he still he's still enrolling people? Oh, he's full. Yeah, it's being tested around, now that one is being tested around social skills, I believe is the target. But there are other cognitive therapists around doing, for example, one important target for cognitive therapy for people on the spectrum is dealing with social anxiety. And so most of it is behavioral therapy rather than cognitive therapy around exposure. So exposure therapy, also around the OCD. And yeah, Gail will help you. The idea is that you have to be sort of, you have to go through the full kind of connection with the therapist to find out what the therapist and or the confluence between the skills of the therapist and the goals and the needs of the patient or client. So, well, what I wanted to say was a lot of what I was talking about is not unique to people on the spectrum. Secondly, siblings, of course, growing up is hard for everybody. And as Melita alluded to, siblings in the family of someone with developmental difference, oftentimes it takes them a little bit longer to go through the adulthood period as well. Okay, maybe for any number of reasons. I won't even speculate because there's more reasons than I could come up with. But I do think that that's why a family approach would work, because it wouldn't just be on directing at what can we get the person with the most clear disabilities, but how do we get everybody to take on more responsibility. Like, if there was a take-home message here, it's this, that adulthood means greater taking, accepting responsibility and or self-determination. And those two need to come together. In other words, if I want to have the right to stay up late and play a video game, or stay up late and do what I want, I also have to be willing to accept the responsibility of helping my mom and dad out in the following way. It's a trade. Okay, instead of it all being, I do what I want, or I get to push everyone away, it's no, for me to get what I want, I have to give in return. So it's the give and take. And if I could simplify what Rostain just spent an hour and a half saying, it's what is adulthood is helping people accept that that's the trade-off, that in order to do the things you want to do, you have to give in return. You have to accept some responsibility. And most youth don't want that. Most youth want to say, leave me alone, I just want to do my thing. And that's a normal way of thinking, but you can't accept that, and you got to challenge it in a gentle way and say, hold on a second. To a degree, you can, but you're not going to drive a car without a license, right? Sure. Okay, now some people do try to drive cars without a license, but most people would agree that in order to drive a car, you have to have a driver's license. And that's a perfect example of you cannot drive till you've shown that you have the ability and can take the responsibility of driving according to the laws. So I like to use that analogy for, however other sets of expectations you have for them. But same for the siblings. They have to go through the same drill. And sometimes siblings resent that the sibling with the disability is getting off the hook and isn't being asked to hold accountable. That's a big source of conflict in the family, is jealousy and conflict between the siblings. And that could be a talk for another seminar. Well, thank you all for hanging out with me. I hope this was worthwhile.